continue.
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2% Better Health Podcast. I'm your host, Carrie Bennett, and I am so honored today to have with me Dr. Gerald Pollack. So I would love to, before we get into this wonderful topic of exclusion zone water, Dr. Pollack, I'd love to give you at least a better introduction than that. So Dr. Pollack is your research is something I've really looked up to. You're a professor at the University of Washington in bioengineering. You are the founding editor-in-chief, I believe, of the Water Journal, which I absolutely love because it is multidisciplinary. And so it takes a topic and we get to look at it from a bunch of different perspectives, which I think is beautiful. Same thing, the founder of the Water Conference. So that's where you offer the conference, I guess, takes a look at the physics, biology, and chemistry of water. Same thing, and that's been going on for several years. And I really appreciate the fact that you put a lot of those on YouTube so that people like me can listen to those talks. And then you have written for 2 very inspiring books. I'm sure more than that, because I know your bio, your website lists a ton of books, but 2 that I have read. One of them that got me started was Cells, Gels, and the Engine of Life. And then this one right here. If I may reveal my nerd brain, this is a page turner, The Fourth Phase of Water. I could not put this book down. It is a pleasure to chat with you, and I'm very excited to talk about the 4th phase of water, and especially ultimately how it applies to health and our own human physiology. So welcome, Dr. Pollack. It's a pleasure.
Thank you, Carrie. Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be here with you. And,
wonderful.
Happy to discuss my favorite topic.
It has also become one of my favorite topics. So I really, really appreciate that. So, for those who are just, I guess, diving into this concept, I'd like to share why water might be different when we think of liquid water in a glass compared to the water that's inside of our cells, inside of our body. So that is what you would consider structured water, ordered water, easy water. So please, Dr. Pollack, what is easy water? How does it form?
Oh, okay. Well, to the first part of as you introduced the issue, many people think that the water inside our body, inside our cells, and we're taught this from the textbooks, is just ordinary liquid water. And if that were true, there'd be a problem, because if you have to cut yourself, the water would come pouring out as it would come pouring out of a faucet, and you'd be awfully dehydrated. Fortunately, that's not the case. And the water that's inside our body mainly is the water that you were alluding to. We call 4th phase or easy structured water. And that water differs from ordinary water in that it's more like a crystal. It's a liquid crystal, and that's what fills the cells, and even beyond the cells inside our body, and it has the consistency of honey, and so it sticks. If you happen to cut yourself, it doesn't come pouring out because it sticks to the solids that are inside of your cell and outside of your cell. So this is not just what we're talking about is not just a laboratory curiosity. It's something that is there in spades. It's all over. It's not only inside our body, but it's also outside our body. And I can explain to you the second part of your question. Well, what is this water exactly? How does it form? I'm transposing your question into my own words. I hope that's what you were asking. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so I guess it can form several different ways, but the most obvious way that it forms is if you have a material, let's say a block of material, and that material surface is so-called hydrophilic. That means if here's the surface horizontally, and if you drop water on it, the water will spread out. It means the surface is hydrophilic. It loves water, as opposed to, say, Teflon, which is hydrophobic, and you put water and the water beads up. So if you have a hydrophilic surface immersed in water, what happens is when the water meets that surface, starting with the first molecular layer, that layer meets the surface and undergoes a radical transformation into a completely different kind of water. And that's what we call EZ water. But it's not just the first molecular layer that, may be of huge interest to chemists, but not to the rest of us. It's not just one layer. When the first layer forms, the second layer, the new layer looks very much like the hydrophilic surface. And the next molecular layer does the same thing. And then the next, and the next, and the next. And these layers, or sheets, or what have you, together, we typically find hundreds of thousands, if not sometimes even millions, that can line up. So it's quite a large amount. And from the beginning of that, where the hydrophilic surface is, to the last layer, we call that the fourth phase, or exclusion zone, easy to remember. And it's also called exclusion zone because it excludes. These layers are really tightly packed with one another, and they exhibit the tendency to exclude most every solute that might want to penetrate. And that's where it all starts. So you might, if you're thinking and curious, which I think most of your listeners are, you might think, well, this sounds like an awfully difficult task of the water to undergo such a transformation. It's got to require energy. And you can apply more formal theorems to demonstrate that it really does require energy, because what you're doing is you're taking something that's random, molecules of water, and converting them into something that's very well organized. And in order to do that, you need energy. You can't do it without. My favorite analogy is your office or your bedroom. You put something down, you put your purse down, or you put your headphones down, or whatever, and gradually it becomes messier and messier. It takes essentially no energy to do that. But if you want to put it back into shape, you really need to do a bit of work. You need to put in some energy, 15 minutes, 30 minutes, half a day. And so it's the same way to get this water to go from the disordered state, that is ordinary liquid water, to the ordered state, which is fourth phase, easy water. You got to put energy in. And the energy comes, this was a real surprise to us. We couldn't figure out the answer because, you obviously can't plug it into the receptacle in the wall. You need some source of energy that's there. We couldn't. Finally, an undergraduate student was doing an experiment in the laboratory, and he was doing what he was not supposed to do, although secretly I encourage the students to do that, try out things, because the younger they are, the higher the level of curiosity. As they get older, they become jaded, and they sometimes become more conservative, if you will. And they don't really give a whole lot of thought to alternative or interesting ideas. And so the student was there, and he was working with a typical setup that we use to observe the exclusion zone. And he was a lamp sitting right next to him. He took the lamp and shined it on the chamber, and he quickly called me in and he said, "Look at this." And where he was shining the light, the size of this exclusion zone or fourth phase grew immensely. And I suggested to him, well, take it away. So he took it away and it went back to where it was. And so that was the clue that we needed to figure out that the energy that for all of this is coming from light. And we did more formal experiments to find out which wavelengths of light were most important. And I guess it came as a bit of a surprise. We tried a range of wavelengths, starting from the shortest wavelength that was convenient for us in the ultraviolet, increasing wavelength to visible, and ultimately toward infrared energy over a reasonable band. And the ultraviolet did nothing, and the visible light did a little bit. And as we got to the infrared, almost abruptly at wavelength of just a little bit beyond red to infrared, at 3 micrometers wavelength, the effect was enormous. It was practically 1,000 times the effect of, say, green light or something like this. So the energy is coming from infrared light, and you know, a lot of people are not so familiar with infrared light. They know the term infrared, but they don't know, you know, where does this come from? And so the first thought is, yeah, you look inside the toaster and you can see it. You know, you push the lever and it's glowing, a beautiful orange, and it feels warm, and you might express that the energy is infrared energy that's coming out, which is almost equivalent to heat, but not exactly. And so so we found that was it. And it's not that it just comes from the toaster or the oven or such. It's actually all over the place, and you can't get rid of it. So if you're to take an infrared camera, for example, first to darken your room so that you can't see anything, and your smartphone camera can't pick up anything. If you were to be able to, if you had an infrared camera, that is a camera whose sensor is sensitive not to the visible wavelengths, but to the infrared wavelengths, even in complete darkness, you get a beautiful image, which means the energy is there, it's coming out. And it's used, of course, by the military at night to see where they can't see otherwise. And so the evidence, though, if you can get an image with this infrared camera, it means that everything is generating or reflecting, whatever, infrared light, and that infrared light is reaching us, and it's reaching the water. So it means the energy that's required for building this is there. And particularly inside our bodies, we have an internal source of infrared because we're metabolizing all the time. As we metabolize, we generate heat, and heat is essentially equivalent to infrared. And so we have the source of energy coming not only from outside, but from inside. So there's plenty of energy available to do, to build those layers that I was talking about. Just one more thing, because
Sure.
I know you got questions and I don't want to just rag on and
That's
on.
okay. No, this is great.
No, well, you know how it goes. My favorite topic, I can talk endlessly.
I hear you.
Yeah. So the other thing we found is that, you know, while water is neutral, H2O is neutral, the exclusion zone typically had a negative charge. We could measure that with tiny electrodes. And the region beyond, where those layers built, just beyond that, has positive charge. So you've got negative charge in the EZ and positive charge beyond, negative, positive separated. You've got a battery. And the battery is charged or recharged using infrared energy. So if you have a battery, you know, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that, hey, wait, if you put 2 electrodes in, one in the negative, one in the positive, you might be able to get electrical energy out of that. And we demonstrated it, that we could do it. We can light a light bulb, an LED actually, which requires less energy, but in principle, we can make it work. And if we put individual cells of this in series, then we could get a higher voltage. And if we put them in parallel, we can get a higher current. So it worked in an entirely conventional way, but in an unconventional source of energy, that is the environment, essentially mediated through water. So all of that has been exciting for us, and we just go on and find additional properties. But I think maybe better stop here so you
No,
can
that's
actually
great.
ask a question.
No, that's super helpful. I think it's good to get everyone on the same page in terms of what's happening with that exclusion zone water. Um, I was guilty, I think, back in undergrad of studying molecular biology and biochemistry and really getting into the nitty gritty of, well, this cascade and this pathway. And, I found it fascinating to memorize these, but when I thought about it in a practical sense, it's fascinating to think about, wait a second, how can this occur in real time all at once? This is so many cellular tasks that have to occur all at once. And so it started me to broaden my perspective of, well, what does everything have in common? And what did we take out? Well, in biochemistry and in anatomy and things, we took out the water. And as soon as you brought it to my attention via your book, that water is everywhere. And Mother Nature is not stupid, right? Water for energy has worked in other systems previously, plants, bacteria. And so it only makes sense that we perhaps have retained some of that ability to generate energy from that exclusion zone water. And my brain now, I believe I've mentioned to you that I've read some of Gilbert Ling's stuff. It's challenging, but I've read some of Gilbert Ling's stuff as well. And I am almost of the opinion that exclusion zone water has the potential to be our primary energy source.
Well, I've been hesitant to suggest that in any public forum, but it could be. If you read Gilbert Ling, I don't know, he passed a year ago at age close to 100. He just missed 100, but he had a website. I don't know if it still exists.
Still up. Yeah, it's still up.
Oh, that's great. Gilbertling.org. And in there he talks about the usual energy source that we learn about in cell biology, and that is ATP. And this is his point, not my point. I'm just reiterating from Gilbert Ling. And yes, his books are a real challenge to read. Indeed, he has quite a few of them. And he talks about the original evidence that ATP has a high energy phosphate bond. This is not his point. He's reviewing. And after that happened, 1 year later, another group, some prominent chemists said, wait a second, you made a mistake in your arithmetic. And nobody, Gilbert says, nobody has ever addressed that challenge to say, yeah, the challenge is really valid, or no, the challengers had it wrong. But, we've gone on to presume that our energy comes essentially exclusively from the high energy bond of ATP. And it might exist, but it might not exist. And, if it doesn't exist, well, it's first of all an embarrassment because it's been in the textbooks for so long. On the other hand, the energy has got to come from somewhere. So where does it come from? And I must admit that the idea that this electrical energy, this battery like in water, is a prominent candidate to explain that, because your body is full of potential energy. And, many of the processes, just as there are actually two kinds of choices that one can make in terms of energy supply. It's like a sailboat versus a powerboat. And if you really want to get from point A to point B, the sailboat is not the way to get there, because if there's no wind, there's no motion. And this is kind of like the ATP story, because if there's a shortage of ATP for whatever reason, you don't have the energy to do what you need to do. But if the energy is potential energy, if it's there all the time, just waiting to be tapped, you just turn the switch and it's there, and boom, you got all that energy that you need. This is a smarter way to drive various processes. So philosophically, it kind of makes sense to think about potential energy. And I think we've identified a potential, if you will, potential source of potential energy, and that is the electrical energy. Mm-hmm. You separate the charge into minus a plus, and that energy, that battery-like energy, can be released and used, and then you restore the energy again for the next event. So, like if your muscle is contracting, I spent 2 or 3 decades dealing with with the molecular mechanism of muscle contraction. And the same story exists there. If you were the designer, so to speak, of muscle, you'd probably, rather than use it, depend on a source of energy that you have to drag out. It's better for the energy to be there, potential energy waiting to be used, because when the frog needs to catch the fly, so that energy's got to be there. You know, you want to make sure it's there, and then you restore it during the time that it's not necessary for you to be using that energy. Unfortunately, people studying muscle contraction, the word water has rarely been invoked. And yet, you know, the muscle, like all the other cells in your body, the muscle cells are roughly 2/3 water, less as we begin to get wrinkles on our forehead. But that water, you know, if you convert that volume fraction, 2/3 into number of molecules. That is, if you line up all the molecules in a particular cell, muscle cell or any cell, and start counting, it turns out that more than 99% of those molecules are water molecules. So, you know, it's hard to think that 99 out of 100 molecules do really nothing more than serving as a bath in which the more important molecules bathe. That's a kind of arrogant statement, absolutely. I think, to dismiss 99% of the molecules as just sort of, you know, being there. They're important for almost nothing. And this is so obviously not the case. And in you know, the two books that you mentioned, the 2001 book, Cells, Gels, and the Engines, will I deal with exactly with that issue. And, you know, I attempted to demonstrate that in half dozen different examples of important critical cells in our body, they follow the paradigm that I'm just talking about, where the energy is right there and available, and it's used to fuel basically a phase transition, a transition in the water and the proteins in order to do the job that needs to be done.
Right.
Okay. Again,
it's great. This is great information. One thing that I think is fascinating is that we do talk a lot about ATP, and we talk about mitochondria making ATP, and then it's almost ignored that, and it's called a byproduct of ATP production, water is made. Right. It's like, it's given a back seat, but I am actually, you know, starting to believe that the water made by the mitochondria and then the heat generated from the mitochondria as well to help structure that water, that might be the primary mechanism. So I just, another instance where I learned all the details of the electron transport chain, and water was ignored when it right in front of me. I can clearly see, in my opinion, I'm not putting words in your mouth, but in my opinion, I think that it's a prime candidate for the energy production in the body. Okay, so I, like any good nerd, I take a bunch of notes on stuff, right? But something that really I loved to hear was, I'm going to kind of paraphrase this from the book, but water acts as a machine that transduces an input radiant energy into many kinds of output energy. And I love the fact that you use the word radiant energy and output energy, because that implies that infrared could be a source of that energy, but perhaps, I know you have discussed things like earthing and grounding and electron flow, like electron semiconduction. So can you just highlight maybe a couple of biological examples of some form of an input radiant energy and then the work that gets done?
Yeah, well, radiant energy is just, I'm, you know, I'm sorry I use that term, because as a scientist, you know, we think of electromagnetic energy, which includes light, as radiant energy, radiant, maybe because of radiation or such. So I'm sorry to lend confusion by using the word radiant energy, but you can just strike it and substitute light or electromagnetic energy.
Sure.
You know, we think of light as being only visible light, but physicists think of light as including the entire electromagnetic spectrum, whose wavelengths extend down on the shorter end and also the longer end of the narrow band that is visible light. It's all radiant energy, it's all light, it's all electromagnetic energy, they're all synonymous. And so I'm sorry for the confusion. That's at the front end, and the back end is doing work.
Sure.
So, you know, work can occur in various forms. If you've got to move your house, which I actually needed to do. My home is now under remediation because the mold content is so incredibly high that
Wow.
they had to do it. It's one of the highest that they've recorded. And I had to move. Unfortunately, I had wrenched my back a month before the time for moving. And my students and colleagues were so kind as to come over and do work. So what's work? Well, they took boxes and they lifted, well, for example, books. They took books from the bookcase, and first they had to vacuum them, and then they put the books in, and then they lifted the box of books, and put them in a certain place. So lifting a weight, that's work. Using electrical energy, it's also work. It's electrical energy powering something, and that's another example of work. Work is, if you look in the dictionary, I haven't done so for a long time, but I think work is defined as the product of energy consumption. So you put energy in, and that energy does something, and it does work of any of various kinds. And I've given a couple of examples. There are probably more. I can't think of them, but probably you can.
So let's talk a little bit about flow. I discuss flow a ton with my clients in terms of blood flow and lymphatic flow. And I know that the exclusion zone can play a prominent role in flow, repulsive forces and such. So if you wouldn't mind maybe going into that a little bit, I'd love to chat.
Yeah, well, there's a lot to say about that.
Sure.
And let me introduce first by flow in trees. Okay, so we all know that it rains, the water gets soaked into the ground, the roots pick up the moisture, and somehow they got a job to do, and that job is to take the water from down and somehow get it to rise up to the leaves, which are often up on top. And the extreme example of that is the redwood tree that's 300 feet tall. If you just think about it, about the work that needs to be done, if you pardon the expression, work in lifting the water up there, it's phenomenal. The way you can think about it is you can take imagine a tube, and the tube is let's say sitting down on the ground, and you pour it, fill the tube. Let's say it's a 10-foot tube, and not 300 feet, even a 10-foot tube. You fill it with water, and you expect the water to want to flow down or up. Well, at the bottom of the tube, pressure, the weight of all of that, and it's difficult for that to flow up. And now, so you need some kind of mechanism to do it. Now multiply that to get to a 300-foot tube, and you can imagine the difficulty that those molecules have of working their way up against that huge pressure that is pushing down. And of course, the botanists have recognized that problem, and suggested a whole bunch of different hypotheses about how the water gets there. And the bottom line, the answer is I'm giving you an answer before I've given you or suggested to you the mechanisms. There's got to be some pump that is pumping it up, and I think we identified that pump. And in the laboratory, you wouldn't think of it as an ordinary pump, but I think it is, because energy is coming in and work is getting done, and it's hydraulic kind of work, involves water.
Mm-hmm.
And the way we found it, we didn't find it in a tree or the xylem, that is those vessels that flow up. We found it in the laboratory originally with a tube made of a strongly hydrophilic material called naphion. And we've repeated the same experiment with many different hydrophilic tubes, and the result is similar. So there was nothing specific to do with that material. And it was noticed by a student. He put a tube of that material in water, and he noticed something that turned out, I think, to be rather phenomenal. And to tell me that, I can't. The incident is so prominent. I'm sitting in my office, talking to someone. I don't remember who the person was, or in the middle of some conversation. He was probably a very important person, so to speak. I don't remember. And the student, instead of knocking at the door, which the student, if my door is closed, which is rare, the student will knock, and be polite, especially students from Asia. This was a Chinese student. And he comes without knocking, he just pokes his head in, and he said, I found something really interesting, and I wanted to tell you about it, interrupting the probably boring conversation that I was having with whomever, I don't remember who it was. He said, I put this tube in the water, and I was watching it, and I noticed that through the tube, the water kept flowing, and it won't stop. And he said, I thought this was interesting. And this is a young student without a whole lot of experience. And he thought it was interesting, and I thought, well, if it's really correct, his observation, and we checked, of course, to confirm that it was real, it was not some kind of experimental artifact. That is amazing, because as we were talking about the requirement of energy to produce work, this is work to drive flow through a tube, because the water has viscosity, and it takes energy to do it, you see. And so I thought, my goodness, if this is really true, not only is it interesting, but it also tends to confirm the idea that the water is always absorbing energy from the environment, because where else is the energy coming from to do this? The tube was laying horizontally in the tube, so there was no pressure difference between the one end and the other end, you see. So there's no pressure differential to drive the flow, as would be the case, say, in our large arteries, where the heart is driving with pressure. So this was really a landmark finding, because we thought, after a bit of head scratching, well, if this is really true, and we, as I said, we confirmed it, it could have enormous application. And one of the applications is indeed what I mentioned in the trees, because all you need to do is take this mechanism, turn it 90 degrees, and it could drive the flow in the xylem from the bottom to the top. And then we thought, well, gee, not only the xylem, but wherever there's flow, always water and a hydrophilic surface. The mechanism, I won't go the exact mechanism. I need a little diagram to show, but it involves exclusion zones, charge separation, etc. It's not complicated, but it's just a little hard to do it without a diagram. And it's described in that fourth phase book that
very nicely
seem to like.
So Oh,
Yeah,
go ahead.
go ahead, please.
So this has applications and all throughout the body because if I would imagine any hydrophilic tube, or probably can't say any, but a lot of hydrophilic tubes inside of the body would be able to use this flow, basically have this flow mechanism happen. So that it goes from the blood vessels all the way maybe into the microtubules of the cytoskeleton where there's nutrients flowing in and out, or where there's fluid flowing in and out. So there's the potential for this to be broadly applicable throughout the whole entire body.
Absolutely, and we've addressed that in recent experiments. You mentioned earlier in the conversation lymph. That's another place where the flow is it's not so clear. It hasn't been so clear where what's driving the flow.
Sure.
Also in veins, there is some theory about venous flow and how it occurs when there's no obvious pressure differential. Some people have given a lot of thought to the sucking mechanism of the ventricle. That's certainly a possibility. But in general, yeah, wherever there's flow, this is an obvious candidate for the flow. And we went on to test it. We tested it. This is a little story that I like to tell. The end result is that we've concluded that this is a highly likely possibility in the bloodstream to drive flow together with the heart. Since William Harvey 400 years ago discovered the circulation, everybody thought that the heart was the sole driver of flow. But indeed, we found that this mechanism that we've been talking about applies in the vessels themselves. The vessels are actually little motors that drive the flow. It's not just the heart. And we have manuscript now that we've submitted for publication on the subject. And I got to tell you the backstory of this because it's so simple and so interesting. And that is, we all think that once the heart stops, the flow stops. But over the past century or so, there have been a half dozen publications, scientific publications that demonstrate that even when the heart stops, the flow continues. It doesn't continue at the same rate. It's much lower, but it continues. And so if the heart is not driving it, something else needs to be driving it. And we found indeed that it's this mechanism. It doesn't necessarily mean that the mechanism is highly subsidiary or secondary to the heart, because the situations in which this is looked at, the heart, instead of turning from being a pump to something neutral, it's actually a blockade. If it's part of the circuit, and if it's not pumping, it's just there blocking. And so if it's blocking, then any kind of flow that might still exist would be greatly reduced because of this blockage. Nevertheless, it keeps flowing at a lower velocity, and something's got to be driving it. And we think we've identified that it's this mechanism that I've just been talking about, the same one that drives the water flow up the trees, is operating not only in my cardiovascular system, but also in yours, probably, I guess.
I'm still kicking, so.
You're still kicking, yeah, okay, so you got it.
I got both the heart and the IR, the EZ flow. So what I thought was interesting was, if nature were to make a pump, right, wouldn't it make sense to put the pump lower in the system, as opposed to, having a pump up here? And then also the idea that the capillaries are small. And so they're oftentimes smaller than the red blood cells are oftentimes larger, right, than the actual capillaries themselves. So the red blood cells have to either get pumped hella hard through the capillaries or almost pulled into the venous system. And so I know that there is also the potential for a charge differential between the arterioles and the venous system that may also drive the red blood cells through the arteries into the veins.
Yeah. So this is a real problem. This is actually how we got started. Exactly the problem you mentioned. It was a trip to Moscow. I went to see my friend, colleague, Vladimir Vyakov, who's a professor of biochemistry at Moscow University. And he quickly introduced me to the his colleague, and the colleague had something to say about exactly what you're talking about the fact that red blood cells in healthy young adults like yourself, uh, the capillaries are as small as 3 or 4 micrometers, pretty narrow, but the blood cells, the red blood cells that need to get through are twice the diameter. And so in order for them to get through, they have to squeeze in some way. And you can see on videos that it's exactly what happens, that they squeeze their way through. And if you think about the energy that's required, again, we're back to energy and work. And so energy is needed to do the work of doing this to these cells so they can actually scoot their way through. And this guy calculated the amount of energy, and he almost smiled when in Russian, which had to be translated. He was telling me, he said, the energy is so big when you think of all those cells that need to go through that if the heart were responsible, the pressure that the heart would need to develop to push those recalcitrant cells through those narrow vessels, like a basketball through a narrow pipe, that the pressure would need to be something like 1 million times the pressure that is being generated. So, it's an absurd amount, and I'm quite familiar with doing calculations of that sort and other sort. And it's easy, very easy to make a mistake by a factor of 10 or even 100, even if it's a mistake of a factor of 1,000, still, it's just too big to envision. So he concluded that there's got to be another source of energy that's helping to drive that through. And that's what tickled me, immediately, because I'm thinking, well, gee, we just, in our laboratory, we just found a mechanism where from infrared energy that's coming in our bodies, not only from outside, but also from inside, from the metabolic energy. There's plenty of energy there to do it. If you have the right kind of transducer, that's something that converts the energy into work, and we identified it. And so the bottom line is that it looks as though in your cardiovascular system, probably mine too, and maybe a few others, sure, including everybody, it may be that it's not just the heart that's doing the work. It may be that the vessels are also doing the work, and we don't know. Probably, maybe the heart is still the dominant one, but it's not so clear. That still remains to be established. How much is the contribution of those vessels?
It makes sense that nature gave us a couple of different mechanisms too for that blood flow. So, I mean, even I know red blood cells moving will generate their own magnetic field too. And does that magnetic field have the potential to create a bigger exclusion zone or an appropriately sized exclusion zone inside the vessels themselves?
Well, yeah, that's a point that I never thought of myself. Thank you for that. However, I must say, we're studying magnets now, and what happens to water in the presence of a magnetic field. And the experiment is really simple, and the result is interesting. And you have a magnet. Let's say this is the North Pole here, and you put it in the water. And in the water, you put little tiny markers. We use little spheres, microspheres. And they're all over the place. And what happens is we know from numerous experiments that if an exclusion zone builds, let's say from the surface of the magnet, it'll push the microspheres out. That's why it's called exclusion zone, because it excludes all kinds of stuff as it grows. So we put the magnet in the water with the microspheres, and we watch in the microscope to see what happens. And sure enough, the microspheres get excluded for a region of anywhere between a 0.5 millimeter and a millimeter over a few tens of minutes, just exactly what happens with so many surfaces that we put into the water. So
That's
this
fascinating.
is
That's great.
incredibly interesting, and it's relevant to the point that you make.
Absolutely. Oh, I love
yeah.
hearing that. That's really cool research. So then another thing that I was interested in is back to kind of my molecular biology days of enzymes, right? And these biochemical reactions and using an enzyme to speed up the reaction. And I know in your book, you alluded to the potential for proton flow and protonicity, potentially to speed up a reaction as a catalysis, like a catalytic reaction. And I'm just wondering if you had any more insight into potentially exclusion zone water acting as an enzyme, if you will, in various reactions.
Well, no more than I've written about as a possibility. I know a colleague who is about to launch, an English colleague, about to launch studies in that direction. But there's, if you think about it, there's something odd or something wrong. If you look at a cell in the microscope, and people have drawn, pictures of what goes on, and the first thing that you notice is that it's incredibly crowded. That the cell is so packed that there actually is not that much water in the cell. It's 2/3 by volume. But if you think about a typical gel, for example, gels might have 10 times that fraction of water, even 100 times that fraction of water. So the cell is really crowded with solids. Ain't much room for the water inside the cell. And then you imagine enzymes are supposed to speed things up. So according to the usual theory, the enzyme and substrate need to be in contact with one another. But it's so crowded in there that you wonder how on earth can anything flow inside the cell. The conduits, I think of Amsterdam and canals and such, and those canals, those conduits are so narrow that even the narrowest of ships can't get through. So and you want to speed things up. You want the cargo to move rapidly through, but there's no way that that's going to happen. And a lot of people have recognized that there's something fundamentally wrong, because to speed up, the two have to get together. In order to get together, you need easy flow, but there's no easy flow because there are obstacles in the way. So there needs to be something else needs to be playing a role. And it might be the protons, which are so small and it can flow through those narrow conduits. Or it could be something maybe more exotic that has to do with information that is transmitted in, shall we say, unconventional ways, using energy that we don't really understand. But there's lots of evidence for something going on that's beyond what we is ordinarily considered in conventional chemistry and physics. So lots of possibilities.
Sorry. No, that's fascinating, because I believe you're alluding to some of Luc Montagnier's research in terms of the DNA and the water having a memory signature of that DNA. And I've also listened to a lot of talks you've given on how water could be a potent quantum computer, if you will. It could have the capabilities of a supercomputer in terms of its ability to store memory. And so I like that aspect, that it makes more sense to me that things aren't necessarily coordinated as a lock and key mechanism, but instead it's a sharing of energy in potentially what we now consider to be a weird way, but it could very well prove to be that is how human physiology runs. I know you don't have to go there. You don't need to go there. I could go there.
No, it's not that. What I'm thinking is that you're way ahead of me, and that maybe the next book you should write instead of me, because with your understanding and your creativity, you're amazing.
Well, thank you. I'm honored. I get to think out on a limb a lot, so I really do appreciate that. So then let's talk a little bit. Is there any, I also kind of have this brain space for exclusion zone water in tumor cells versus in normal cells. Has it ever been observed that the exclusion zone water in or around a cancerous cell is any different?
I missed the middle of your sentence.
Oh.
There was a technical, but I
Sure.
think I got it. Yeah, and cancer cells about the water. Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, indeed. So um, how to address this? Um, there have been experiments that show in the past that the water in cancer cells is less structured than ordinary water. And it has a lot of implications. I'll get to that in a moment if you remind me if
Sure. I'd
if
love
I go
to.
off on tangent and forget. But yeah. So but I want to address this in a way that appeals to me.
Sure.
So it's 2 or 3 steps. So if you just bear with me.
Sure.
Okay, first thing is that every cell has a net negative charge. If you stick electrodes, you know this, but your listeners may not.
Yeah.
You stick electrodes into a cell and you measure a typical cell in my body, maybe between 50 and 100 millivolts negative. This is typical. Why is that? If you read the textbook, you'll find that it has to do with pumps and channels in the membrane of the cell. And I believe that's not correct for various both experimental and logical reasons, which I don't need to. I don't want to go into. It's too much of a tangent. But just one point to make is that if you look at it, if you stick the same electrode into a gel instead of into a cell, you get pretty much the same result, even sometimes larger negative electrical potential. But there's no membrane, therefore no pumps, no channels, nothing like that, but the same results. And so it becomes a little bit difficult to attribute this negative charge inside the cell or inside the gel in general to some membrane gadgets. Okay, so where does it come from? Well, there's a very simple explanation where the negative charge comes from, and that is the negatively charged easy water that fills the cell. You know, you take a supermarket bag and you fill it with negative charge and and close it, and you got negative charge inside. You stick an electrode in and you'll read negativity. So, okay, so if a cell is filled with easy water, you'll get a negative electrical potential, let's say of minus 60, 70, 80 millivolts. If it has less easy fourth phase water, you'll get a smaller magnitude of that negative potential. And indeed, 60 years ago, 70 years ago, when people were sticking these electrodes into cell rather routinely, I even did some experiments myself. But if you did stick it into a cancer cell, instead of minus 60 or minus 70, you get minus 10 or minus 20.
Wow.
So, wow, what does that mean? Well, for me, what it means is that it's got less easy water inside the cell, the more ordinary water. And for some reason, the easy water is not getting built up inside the cell. And if the easy water is not getting built up inside the cell, in the case of a cancer cell, the cell looks like it's activated because during activation, the electrical potential of all, all such cells will go from minus 60 or minus 70 to somewhere around 0. That is, the water is undergoing a transition from the structured EZ fourth phase state to ordinary water, and then it goes back again. But in the cancer cell, it looks like the cell is perpetually activated. And what do activated cells do? Well, in the case of cells that undergo mitosis, it turns on the splitting, it turns on the division of cells, and that's exactly what cancer cells do. They undergo rapid division. So the bottom line is, yes, in answer to your question, it looks as though there's less structured, easy fourth phase water inside the cancer cell. And it's entirely possible, nobody studied this, that very fact that there's diminution of the ordinary amount of easy water inside the cell makes it a cancer cell and makes it keep dividing. So there might be a very tight and close link between what we've been talking about and cancer.
That's great.
We haven't pursued it, but
it's fascinating. I mean, it also then would make sense why cancer cells are basically glucose hoarders, as they're trying to derive energy from a glucose fuel source because they don't have as much exclusion zone water.
Well, that could
well
well be.
Potentially the acidic environment also of the cancer cells tumor cells are generally more acidic, correct? Are you familiar with Mina Bissell's work at all at UC Berkeley?
With whom?
Mina Bissell at UC Berkeley. She did.
Sorry.
Okay, never mind. She did she looked at the extracellular matrix with mammary cells. It was very fascinating. So it kind of goes along with this. Okay, so then I want to be respectful of your time. I very much appreciate all of this. Love chatting with you. I would love to just then, I guess, talk about what you would consider some important practical takeaways. So this is my podcast is the 2% Better podcast, because I find it's not necessarily one gigantic thing, but sometimes it's the accumulation of these little 2% health improvements that when we look back 3-5 years from now, we're like, oh, wow, that all really made a difference. And so if you had a couple of 2% around exclusion zone water and the buildup of this easy water inside of us as a potent health promoter, what recommendations would you give, or what do you do personally to build that easy water?
Okay, when you were talking about, I thought you were headed toward technological kinds of innovations.
Awesome, that'd be great too.
Well, okay, remind me, because
okay, yeah. Absolutely.
But in terms of health, so from what we've learned in the laboratory, I'm just projecting from that. If you want to retain your health, what you need to do is to be sure that all your cells are filled with a full complement of easy water, because without that easy water, and I gave the example of cancer cells, which I think has less easy water than normal cells. You want to make sure that you have a full complement, because everything the cell does, it doesn't matter what kind of cell, everything, it needs a full a cell full of easy water, because it's the action of the cell. It turns out, as described in the Cells Gels book, the action of the cell involves the so-called structured water that's in the cell. If you don't have enough of it, it can't function properly, and so it's either pathological or dysfunctional. And so the idea is to try to restore the amount, and you could do it any number of simple ways. The first way is drinking more water, because it's the raw material for building easy water. Your body converts what you drink into easy water, or the second way is to bypass that conversion process and drink water that contains a lot of easy water. And the easy way to do that, so-called easy, I'm sorry, the two, easy to forget the difference between easy and easy. Easy to do that is to do a so-called juicing, where you go out to your backyard and you take the freshly grown plants, and you basically squeeze them and get rid of the solids, which would, if you were to eat them, they'd rapidly fill you up. You wouldn't want any more. Squirt out the juice, or squeeze out the juice and drink the juice. So what are you drinking? Well, you're drinking the water from inside the plant cells, and those are fresh, robust plant cells growing in your backyard. And inside the cells, just like inside your healthy cells, it's filled with easy water. And so we actually looked at it and confirmed that indeed it's easy water inside those cells, and then you're drinking easy water. So if you drink it, basically the easy water will eventually fill cells that are deficient with easy water. It may be a bit different from as I'm describing, but essentially it's the same. So that's another way. Another way to Sun's full of infrared energy. Half of it roughly is infrared. That's why it feels warm. And expose yourself to the sun. And this should be building easy in your body. Where I live in Seattle, we don't see so much sun in the wintertime. When the sun comes out, everybody's happy suddenly because and we think this is a purely psychological effect. You're being relieved from the confinement of darkness to sunshine. And it may be a psychological effect, or it might be that the infrared energy is penetrating even your skull into your brain, and some wavelengths demonstrably do that because of technological devices built on that principle. Sure. So it gets into your brain and builds easy water, and because it builds easy water, you feel like you should be feeling, which is good, not depressed or what have you. So
I love that.
So yeah, that's another way, and the extreme of that is to immerse yourself in a sauna, or as the Finns would say, a sauna. And I don't know, probably you've had the experience. Yeah, I've had the experience, and I tell you that it can be magical. I remember in a store in Finland, I arrived, I gave a talk, and they took us to a party in the evening, and I was jet lagged, tired. All I wanted to do is to go back to the hotel, get into to bed, go to sleep. And at about 10 p.m. at this social dinner, dancing, whatever, so the organizer stands at the microphone, and I thought for sure he's going to say, okay, now where the buses are loading to go back. And he said, okay, the sauna is now open. We got 3 different ones you can go to. He described, et cetera, et cetera. And I decided, okay, I'll go. 20 minutes later, I felt as though I'd had 8 hours of sleep or more. I was just raring to go. I couldn't believe the difference. And so why is this so effective? And why have so many people emulated that by getting infrared lights and having their own sauna? And there are many thoughts. And my thought is that it's the infrared energy. It's penetrating your body. It's providing, the heat is essentially infrared, and it's building easy in your cells. And so it's another way of restoring yourself. Okay, another one is the food that you eat, or maybe I should say the herbs that you eat. And many of them have been known for hundreds, thousands of years, millennia, including back to Ayurvedic times in India. And we were scratching our heads. Why are these substances so health promoting as they are? Some of them have been touted as being able to solve health problems that total 20 or 30 different syndromes. And my colleagues and I are thinking, can let's say turmeric, can that really have can there be 30 turmeric receptors and all over your body, or is there one effect, and that one effect is pervasive all over the body? And it didn't take much head scratching before we thought, well, it could be the water, because if turmeric happened to build easy water, that would do it. And we tested it in the laboratory. We published, and we examined a half dozen, or by now more, substances that are touted as being good for health. Besides turmeric, there's basil, holy basil is another one. We even studied aspirin, which comes from the bark of a willow tree. We studied ghee, clarified butter, which has been really important in India and increasingly outside. And all of those build easy at concentrations that we would have ordinarily in our body. They all did the exclusion zone a bit more easy. It could be that the impact of these is a very simple explanation. It feels easy. Okay. Oh yeah. Finally, one more about grounding yourself or earthing yourself. What does that do? Well, I think there are a lot of theories on why it's so effective. It really does seem to be effective. People, if you walk barefoot on the beach, for example, you feel good and you're connecting yourself to the earth. And I remember as a child growing up in Brooklyn, New York, where there's a beach, and in the summertime, everybody heads to the beach. You can't even walk from the street to the water because there are no places to walk. It's just filled with people. It's crowded. I remember a kid, 10, 11, 12 years old, getting buried by my friends up to here. And at the end of the day, we had to go home. They wanted to unbury me. And I remember to this day, absolutely not wanting to get unburied because it felt so good. And I don't know why I remember it, because I don't remember so much that happened at that age, but I remember that feeling because it was so powerful and so strong, being buried. And now I understand better. My entire body was connected to the earth. And here's the key. The key is that the earth is not neutral. It's negatively charged. I began my career as an undergraduate studying electrical engineering. And no professor ever told me that the earth was anything but neutral. You know, you plug that plug in and the third prong, the round one, is connected, we thought, to zero electrical potential. Neutrality ain't so. And I couldn't believe that I was being so misled by all the professors. They themselves didn't know, because in this country we don't know about this, but in other countries they do. And so I learned this fact from a Russian colleague, Andrei Klimov, who was in my laboratory for a while, and he was talking about, as he was departing for his flight home, he was telling me about the Earth's electric field. Electric field? I said, Andre, you must be talking about the magnetic field, because I never heard of an electric field. He said, what? You never heard? You don't know that the Earth is negative and the ionosphere is positive, and it's like a capacitor with an electric field that runs? I never heard of such a thing, I said. And Andre said, well, there must be something deficient either with you or with your educational system in the US, because in Russia, every middle school student knows that the Earth is negatively charged. Wow. Shame on me. I had trouble sleeping that night, not because of the insult, but because of the potential implication of this, if true. And I wasn't so sure, because Andre is a creative guy with a lot of creative ideas. And next morning, one of my students brings me the lectures of the famous or legendary physicist Richard Feynman, the Nobel laureate, who many people consider the Einstein of the second half of the previous century, also a funny guy. And the 3 volumes, they're so famous that they're read by, I think they're still read by pretty much every physics graduate student in the US. And volume 2, chapter 9, he opens it. The whole chapter deals with the negative the negative charge of the Earth. And so, you know, when you think about that the Earth has negative charge, the implications of this are enormous. And I don't want to deviate by talking about it, but my forthcoming book is dealing largely with that and with the enormous implications of that.
Oh, that's exciting.
Enormous. And so as soon as I can get my son, who's the artist, to finish the illustrations, he's working on remodeling his home. And so he's got some family pressures to finish.
Understandable.
Yeah, you got it. So at any rate, so the Earth is negative. And so, and then we close the loop. So if you connect yourself electrically with the negative Earth, what happens is that it's just an infinite supply of electrons. And if you have part of your body, some of your cells that have negative charge, or EZ, negatively charged. The two are almost synonymous. These negative charges will run into your body and fill those cells. And so if they fill the cells, then your cells are restored to, and I just should interject that, because what I just said may sound a little bit vague, but we found that if you take an electrode and you immerse it in water and pass electrons in, you build easy water. And so the same thing should be happening inside your cells, inside your body. You connect yourself to a source of negative charge, the electrons come running in quickly, and you build easy water. And there you go. So I've tried to list a half dozen different expedients, I think most of which are not too complicated, and those should be beneficial to health, theoretically speaking, and also there's a lot of practical experience for pretty much all of what I've said that suggests that these are mechanisms that could indeed operate in that way.
I love that.
So
I really appreciate that, Dr. Pollack. And I love the fact that grounding under natural sunlight is free, right? Grounding in sunlight is free. And so that is, sounds like quite a profound way to, I guess, semiconduct electrons and then the infrared light from the sun as just like a perfect combination for not only charging us with that exclusion zone, but, filling us with those electrons, creating massive exclusion zones wherever they're needed. And since everything that we've talked about in this podcast, we know that this exclusion zone, we believe, relates to health and energy and vitality, seems to be a pretty profound but simple at the same time. And I love that.
Well, thank you. I like it too. You'd think that I'd be practicing same, and on occasion, now and then I do, but I have to be reminded, for example, to myself to drink enough water. It's easy to forget that. If you've got a busy life, you have no time to pick up the glass and drink the water.
Right. Everyone's. So I have one of these grounding mats that I prefer to be outside, but underneath my desk, just in case I need to, conduct electrons. I always try to do that too.
Do you take your shoes off?
I do have my shoes off. Yeah, I'm barefoot almost all the time. So.
Okay, you've got it. Yeah.
Do you want to touch on the technological filtration devices or technology at all, or are you happy with how we've given everything?
I let me just do that to kind of end, because I need to be off soon. I'm while my house is being remediated, I'm at a facility which is actually a retirement facility about 100 miles from my home, and someone offered it for free, and so they have fixed times for meals, and if you want to get a meal, you can't be late. Okay. It's not that I think the food is so great, but sometimes your stomach hungers for something. Yeah, I just touch on, because these are really important. And so the first is, I guess, filtration. And I mentioned that EZ water is exclusion zone, and it was called that because first of all, EZ is easy to remember, at least in this country where it's not EZ, but EZ, easy to remember. But it's called exclusion zone because it excludes stuff. It excludes almost everything. And it also excludes the pharmaceuticals that are polluting our waters. And so if you could collect this EZ, basically it would be water that has been freed of all of these contaminants. And for us, this is an exciting development, and we've been working on it. There are technological obstacles that remain to be solved, that have not yet been solved, but we're indeed getting there. And an offshoot of that, maybe it's more than just an offshoot, is the possibility of separating salts from the water. You might think of salt as a contaminant. And so the idea is that you can have a device which does this separation, and it's not complicated to envision various geometries that can do that, from which you can then extract the easy water, but it turns out the easy water excludes salt, and so we've just barely begun the idea of taking ocean water in and trying to separate the salt from the water, so that you can not only get salt-free water to drink,
Wow.
but that salt-free water should be easy water, which is good for health. So it's a double
Wow.
whammy, and since getting easy or building easy comes from environmental energy, it's always there. You don't need to put in extra energy, like for example from petroleum, from oil, where it is quite abundant in the Arabic countries in the Middle East. They can afford the reverse osmosis, which accomplishes that, but it's very expensive in terms of the energy that you need. Well, here, the energy comes from the sun. It's free. It's free for the taking. So in theory, we're not there yet, but in theory, it ought to be able to, you ought to be able to separate the salt from the ocean water by virtue of the energy of the sun, which is abundant in those dry areas, and get drinking water, which is not abundant in those areas. So for us, this is ordinary filtration is interesting. Getting salt separated is even more interesting than that. That's two. And there's a third one, and that was implicit in what we were talking about, is getting electricity from water. I mentioned early on that separating the water into the negatively charged EZ and the positive charge beyond. You're separating charge and creating a battery. And you just take two electrodes and connect them, and you can get electrical energy out of that. So, at least in theory, in the laboratory, it's possible to get electrical energy merely from water. It's water and sunlight. It's as natural as you can get, and you can exploit that under the right circumstances. It's totally renewable, and use it. And so we've demonstrated that in the laboratory, but going from a laboratory demonstration to something practical is a real challenge. It's in the trade, it's known as crossing the valley of death, because a lot of ideas can't cross that valley to the other side, where it's actually something that's viable for practical use. So we have that in mind. So there are more, but those are the three sort of major technological achievements, or objectives, I should say, not achievements, because we're not there yet. And we've discovered, I'm not a sort of business oriented. These are mostly intended for humanity, not for business. But there have to be some business aspects, because in order to do the technological development, you need money to hire the people to do it. And so that's an obstacle.
So you do have I believe it's an organization that or a charity. I don't want to misspeak, but I do believe that you have a venture research institute.
Yeah, well, So I should clarify. We have an institute. It's called the Institute for Venture Science, and I tell you just a few words about that. But let me start by saying this is not an institute that's designed to support my own personal laboratory or any kind of developments, because I'm the executive director of this organization, and
Sure.
And it's a charity. Basically, it's classified as a charity, and it would be completely unethical to take money from that and direct it my way. So in fact, I'm, if anything, excluded from profiting from that organization. But I'm glad you mentioned it, because this is an exciting venture, if you will, and the idea is to use this money, private money, governments won't support this, money to support scientific endeavors that challenge those notions have outlived their usefulness.
Mhm.
And so we're a relatively new organization, and we've vetted more than 200 pre-proposals down to a dozen proposals, from which we've selected 5 projects or 5 groups of people in different scientific areas, where if the money were available for these people, and if their hypotheses turned out to be valid, it would shake the earth.
Wow.
Absolutely. And these people have great difficulty getting money otherwise, because, as you know, the challenge in the mainstream comes with consequences, and one consequence is to not get funding very easily.
Sure.
And so we try to provide a vehicle for those people. But just one last little twist. You know, if you were the person applying, and you were suggesting, for example, that the Earth is round, but everybody knows the Earth is flat, and at this time, you know, and you were lucky enough to get money from any organization. You probably wouldn't, because the people reviewing your application for funding are the ones who would feel threatened by your revolutionary idea.
Mhm.
Flat Earth people, they don't like to be proven wrong by round Earth folks. So, you know, you're not like, but if you do get your money, then and you go on to produce some new evidence besides the satellite photos, you know, et cetera, et cetera. They're going to stand up and say, "Oh, Carrie, she's a crackpot. Don't pay any attention to her." And then, well, what do? You stand up and wave a flag and say, "No, I'm not a crackpot. Pay attention." You know,
Right.
you're done,
Mhm.
essentially. And all over the internet. Oh yeah, Carrie, she's just, don't pay any attention to her. She's nuts, and she's a crackpot. So this is inevitable. It's not
Sure.
plausible. It's inevitable. And so our institute recognizes that. And if we fund you, our objective is to fund up to a dozen other groups around the world who share your vision, that, you know, the Earth might well be round. And then what happens is in this case, next year's at the annual conference of the Shape of the Earth Society, suddenly a dozen groups are reporting, hey, you know, using a dozen different methods independently,
Brilliant.
the Earth is round. And then the revolution comes.
That's
and,
brilliant.
Well, thank you. We're now looking for the private funding
Sure.
that we need to support, because these endeavors are not cheap. And I know there are a lot of people who have done well in their careers and who would like to give back in a meaningful way, especially now with so much emphasis on disinformation. It's almost unbelievable. And, you know, this finds its way into the scientific arena. It's so important to deal with truth. And sometimes, you know, the textbooks teach us something that is simply not true. And it's difficult for scientists to challenge these. And we are making it easy for scientists to challenge and to create scientific revolutions, of which there have been so few. If you think about it,
Sure.
you know, you may be looking at the internet and reading the New York Times or Washington Post or whatever, and it's really hard to identify scientific breakthrough revolutions. I don't mean technological revolutions, you know, like my laptop computer that I'm using and Zoom. They're technological revolutions. They're amazing, but they're technological, not scientific. By scientific, I mean the genetic code. That was the mid-50s, the splitting of the atom, 1940s. You know, we're dealing with almost a century ago, more than a half century ago, and it's really hard. If I were to ask you to name a scientific revolution of equal importance that's occurred during the past, say, 30 years or so, despite huge amounts of monies being put into science, it's really hard to identify ones that have changed everything, changed
Sure.
entire life. We need them. Scientific revolutions, inevitably lead to technologies that can help solve the problems of the world. And those are desperately needed right now. And so anybody who's interested, the URL is easy to remember. It's IV, like, intravenous, ivscience.org.
Perfect.
.com will get you there too, I think, but .org.
Wonderful.
ivscience.org. Take a look.
I will. I'll make sure I link it too. I really, really appreciate that. I feel like breakthroughs don't happen in the middle. They happen on the fringe, and people need to feel comfortable getting to the fringe and exploring. So
absolutely. You hit the nail on the head, Carrie. You're amazing.
You're amazing, Dr. Pollack. I so appreciate you taking the time. Thank you. Thank you. This has been wonderful. And again, I really appreciate you.
Okay. It's been my pleasure.
All right.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.